I think one of the big elements of my developing thesis is that people who today are at that stage of life, if they try to ask their parents or just like subconsciously draw from their childhood experience, for a number of reasons, that will not serve them well.
Why not?
Because I think that marriage and family dynamics have changed too much in one generation.
Can you explain more what you mean?
Welcome. I'm so glad you could join us. Please come in. Your presence honors us. Here at the Mr. Homemaker podcast, we share our stories and challenges, collect the best expert advice, and offer one another support as we learn to manage our households. Your perspective and contributions will be very valuable. And just in time, today's discussion is about to begin. It is my pleasure to present Mr. Homemaker.
Thank you for joining me for this bonus episode of the Mr. Homemaker podcast. I believe that over the past 70 years or more, mindsets and lifestyles related to marriage and family have changed in detrimental ways, and that millennials today confront a crisis, as will Generation Z very soon. For those of you who are already listeners to our podcast, you'll know that this topic has come up as an underlying thread throughout discussions with my wife. Today, I want to take a closer look at working theory of what the conditions and causes of this crisis are, as a step toward diagnosing how we can respond and recover from the crisis as a generation and a society. But first, it's important to step back and recognize the challenges and limitations of our ability to intuitively or rationally evaluate history, culture, values, and lifestyles. For one thing, the family origin stories we all receive from our parents, the historical narratives we learn in school, and the popular commentaries we receive from social media and political influences, all of these serve as the raw material from which we each craft our understanding of who we are and how we relate to other people. The ideas and modes of thought that we incorporate into our psychological foundation quickly move from the arena where we can employ dispassionate, rational thought to the arena where any alternative fact or contradictory narrative is perceived emotionally as a threat to our personal identity and worth. Our psychological fight or flight response kicks in. For another, each of us is limited by our direct experience and point of view. There is no shortcut to downloading unfiltered, raw facts and data like the Matrix. Instead, we are each working with limited information that we obtain sporadically from uncertain sources and through the imperfect filters of our own mindsets and understanding. In particular, what we all struggle to comprehend and appreciate is just how long human history has been, and contrast that with how much has changed so drastically in the past few centuries and decades. This offers us very little data or qualitative basis for genuinely evaluating some of our recent innovations and revolutions in society, family, and marriage. There's no better illustration of this than the one given by President John F. Kennedy, as he set the stage to declare that the United States would undertake to put a man on the moon. He said, quote, "No man can fully grasp how far we have come, but condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of about half a century, or 50 years. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except, at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover themselves. Then about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a car with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week, we developed penicillin and television and nuclear power. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ails as it dispels old." End quote. With these difficulties in mind, please strive with me to carefully re-examine our assumptions and evaluate facts, figures, and hypotheses as even-handedly and open-mindedly as we can. And please be patient with me when I inevitably fall short myself, because here on the Mr. Homemaker podcast, I'm not presenting firm theories and conclusions. Rather, I'm transparently sharing my working hypotheses and thought process as it develops. Let's start with the basics. Since 1900, there have been 7 generations born in America. Around 1913, the greatest generation was born, followed by the silent generation in 1934. Then there were the baby boomers of the 1940s and 50s, followed by Generation X, those born in the 60s and 70s. Millennials, such as myself, were born in the 80s and 90s, followed by Generation Z, those born from 2001 to 2013. And finally, children born since 2014 are Generation Alpha. Now, at any given time, there are members of at least 5 generations living simultaneously, each at a different stage of life, and each experiencing, perceiving, and integrating world events and cultural currents into their worldviews very differently. Children, those 15 and under, are trying to understand how the world works, while adolescents and young adults, those 16 to 25, are setting goals and making plans for their lives. This group is the principal target audience of pop culture, and we'll see as we continue why that is so important. Parents of young children from the age 26 to 40 are being tested as they take on greater responsibilities and work to put their life plans into practice. This group drives consumer activity. Middle-aged people, 41 to 60, are in the final phase of their careers, striving to achieve their goals before retirement. This group occupies top positions in industry and government. And finally, retired folks, over 60, have fewer obligations, more leisure time, and are disproportionately drivers of political and community activities as both voters and volunteers. Now, with this basic general framework established, let's plot some key historic events and cultural data points to see what patterns, correlations, and possible hypotheses we can develop about cause and effect. In the early 1900s, from 1901 to 1924, the greatest generation were children, trying to understand how the world works, and the world they lived in was one of great optimism. The Wright brothers achieved flight. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. And women won the right to vote. But it was also a world of great hardship, including World War I and the Spanish influenza, which, in a world with a much smaller population than today's, killed approximately 50 times as many people as COVID has. Family life during the greatest generation's childhood included an average family size of 3.35 children. 88.5% of women were full-time homemakers, and 95% of marriages lasted until the death of a spouse. As the greatest generation advanced from childhood into adolescence and young adulthood, from 1925 to 1942, as they were setting their goals and making plans for their lives, they endured the Great Depression and the beginning of World War II. Both of these imposed significant hardships across society, and, for those who survived, imbued them with a constant reminder of their own mortality. During the greatest generation's parenting years, from 1943 to 1964, the whole world transitioned from the acute crisis of World War II to the turbulent stalemate of the Cold War. After enduring depression and war, the greatest generation rode a wave of economic prosperity to recreate domestic life. Along with the generation immediately following them, the silent generation, born 1925 to 1942, they brought the average marriage age to its lowest level from 1900 to the present. The average age for a man to get married was 23, and for women, just 20 years old. They also had the largest families, with the average number of children per family at 3.62 children. The greatest generation also rode this wave of prosperity to recreate and build upon the optimism of their childhood. As children, they saw man take flight. As adults, they enabled the beginning of the space race. As children, they saw women win the right to vote. As adults, they led the fight for civil rights. And as children, they saw the telephone adopted, while as adults, they put a television in every living room. The most popular show on that television? I Love Lucy. At the same time, however, there were some significant departures from the domestic life of the greatest generation's childhood. While 88.5% of women in their parents' generation were full-time homemakers, only 66% of women in the greatest generation dedicated themselves to homemaking. Divorce was also twice as common among the greatest generation, at a rate of 10%, while for their parents it had been just 5%. This is also the earliest period for which I was able to find the following data. While the greatest generation were parents, 5% of children born during that period were born to an unwed mother. And 9% of all children, 18 and under, were living in a household consisting of a single adult. This is the society and domestic life in which the greatest generation gave birth and began raising the baby boomer generation. My working hypothesis is that this is when our society reached an inflection point, and ever since, we have been careening down a path of family and marital self-destruction. The greatest generation possessed three puzzle pieces. First, having witnessed the fight for women's suffrage in their childhood, both men and women observed public discord between the sexes, and likely between their own parents at a very early age. They also experienced the resulting tribalism among their own sex. Second, women of the greatest generation had, for the first time in history during World War II, been encouraged in mass to take on industrial work previously performed exclusively by men, a la Rosie the Riveter. These women had tasted a life of financial self-sufficiency, free from responsibility to or for anyone but themselves. Third, economic growth, the popularization of the automobile, and the establishment of the interstate highway system all served to break apart extended families and cohesive local communities, replacing them with suburban bedroom communities with white picket fences, which became iconic. The unforeseen effect of this geographic reorganization of society was that wives and mothers of the greatest generation were drastically more isolated and less supported than their own mothers had been. Now that we have a good understanding of the cultural currents that shaped the greatest generation and their adult domestic life, let's discuss the generation spanning 1946 to 1964. People born in that time span, the greatest generation's children, are the baby boomers. Baby boomers played their own part in putting these puzzle pieces together. As children, they not only witnessed their mothers struggling to sustain the household while isolated from the support system of extended family and long-standing friendships, but along with her, they suffered from a new life where their father, their mother's husband, was away from the home at a factory or office to which he commuted a long distance each day. Women finding themselves in this situation after spending their young adulthood single and unburdened by responsibility and financially independent would understandably feel duped and bitter. It would not be surprising if baby boomers witnessed the resulting tension and resentment between their parents, particularly on the part of their mothers, with whom they were more sympathetic. The childhood baby boomers experience and the form of marriage and family life they witnessed in the 1950s, a way of life never before seen in human history, poisoned the well for many of them against marriage and family. We should be sympathetic toward baby boomers that, particularly as children, they had neither the knowledge nor the maturity to realize that the root cause of the problems they experienced and witnessed were not marriage and family themselves, but rather the particular form of marriage and family and community that their parents had stumbled into. During their adolescent and young adult years, from 1965 to 1979, baby boomers put their skepticism toward marriage and the family into action and signaled their broader anti-materialistic, anti-establishment, and anti-Vietnam War sentiments. In the words of History.com, 500,000 of them at a little place called Woodstock, quote, proved to the world that 500,000 kids can get together and have 3 days of fun and music, end quote. Music, of course, refers to rock and roll. And fun, of course, refers to sex and drugs. Baby boomers were encouraged in all of this by pop culture. The most popular song in this period was Al Green's Let's Stay Together, a love song that expresses a desire to be together, but noticeably free from reference to any marital or family ties or commitments. In television, while the most popular show of their childhood had been I Love Lucy, a show essentially about healthy marriage and fulfilling family life, with the additional plotline of Lucy's constant desire to pursue her career ambitions despite her husband's wishes, which of course clearly reflected the greatest generation's principal marital conflict. Contrast that to when the baby boomers were the target audience in their adolescence and young adulthood. The most popular television show was All in the Family, a show about adult baby boomers who live in their parents' basement and seize every opportunity to enlighten their prejudiced and uneducated parents, the greatest generation. Similarly, the most popular movie of this period was The Godfather, in which Al Pacino plays the leading role of a hypocritical, corrupt, and even criminal member of the greatest generation. In the political arena, as if on cue, Richard Nixon made himself the real-life poster president for hypocrisy, corruption, and criminality with the Watergate scandal, cover-up, and his resulting resignation. Two other landmark political events occurred during this period, neither of which can be ascribed to the baby boomers themselves, since they were too young to effect these results. But these events changed the course of their lives and American society since. First, beginning in 1969 in California, no-fault divorce became the legal norm. Prior to that, in order to be granted a divorce by the state, one spouse had to prove to a judge that the other spouse had committed some material offense, such as adultery or abandonment. Since 1969, however, under no-fault divorce, a marriage can be ended by either or both spouses for any reason, or no reason at all. Second, in 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its decision in Roe v. Wade, requiring states to permit abortion for the leading reason that having to raise unwanted children may lead to a distressful life. When baby boomers became parents themselves from 1980 to 2000, they did so in a manner dramatically different from their parents. While their own fathers and mothers were typically married at 23 and 20 years old, respectively, baby boomers' average marriage ages were 26 and 24. And while baby boomers grew up in families of 3.62 children, their own families included only 2 children on average. There's an obvious connection between this pair of trends and another pair of trends. For one thing, the percentage of people earning college degrees doubled, with 20% of the population holding a degree when the baby boomers were parents, while only 10% had held one when the greatest generation were parents. For another thing, while approximately 1 in 3 women of the greatest generation had participated in the labor force, nearly 2 of every 3 baby boomer women participated, including 65% of mothers with children under 18. Let me pause here to head off the criticism that I am arguing, and I quote, that women should stay barefoot and pregnant and that they should be less educated than men, unquote. Incidentally, I'm quoting a criticism from my wife, if you are wondering. I am not making any assertions or arguments that the education of women is a bad thing. Rather, I'm highlighting the mindsets and lifestyles that have accompanied college life, both during and after college, in America for the past 50 years. First, college has normalized spending critical young adult years when a person is setting goals and making plans for their lives, deprived of the support and guidance of their family, their childhood friends, and familiar community. In an artificial environment isolated from regular domestic and community life, such as participating in or witnessing child rearing, elder care, and local community events and involvement, encourages focusing on career at the expense or exclusion of everything else on the surface, while outside the classroom, socially normalizing self-indulgent and immature behaviors, sowing wild oats and finding oneself through frivolous spending, overeating, alcohol and drug abuse, and of course, promiscuity. Next, college sets people on a course to further break family and community ties once they've left university, geographically reshuffling themselves as they move to new places, seeking the jobs that their degrees supposedly prepared them for. Next, all of this encourages and incentivizes delaying marriage. And, if marriage does come, deprioritizing and resenting domestic life and child rearing as an encroachment on the individual career and lifestyle goals set in those college years. Fourth, normalizing households where both parents work means children not only have less quantity and quality of time with their own parents, but also have less time with their siblings, their relatives, and their neighbors, as they spend most of their waking hours in age-segregated childcare, school classrooms, and extracurricular activities. So, again, I'm not attacking anyone being educated, but I am increasingly skeptical about an institution that fosters wasting time, making poor choices, and distracts and discourages from relationships and lifestyles that are most conducive to human flourishing. Not to mention, all while saddling participants with a debt that will trap them in the rat race for the next 10 to 20 years. All of these trends, converging in the context of no-fault divorce, created the high watermark for divorce rates in America. While only 5% of the greatest generation's parents ever divorced, which the greatest generation doubled to 10%, baby boomers doubled down again to achieve a divorce rate of 20%. But for baby boomers' children, the millennial generation, neither the innovations nor the dysfunctions of family life ended there. During the Millenials' childhood, the greatest increase in the number of children born to an unwed mother was achieved. While only 5% of baby boomers were born to an unwed mother, 28% of millennials were. And 19% of all children under 18 years old during this period were raised in a single-parent household, more than doubling baby boomers' own childhood. And finally, this period included the high watermark that for every 7 millennials born, 3 pregnancies were aborted. During this period from 1980 to 2000, when baby boomers were in their parenting years, Generation X was in adolescence and young adulthood, setting goals and making plans. In pop culture, the most popular television shows were Cheers, a show about middle-aged men drowning their sorrows, complaining of failed careers and dysfunctional home lives while pursuing casual hookups, and Murphy Brown, a show about a high-powered career woman who is celebrated for electing to give birth to the child she conceived with her estranged ex-husband, and then raise that child as a single mother. Outside pop culture, in the realm of world events, the Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The internet became mainstream, and the United States and its allies expelled Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army from Kuwait in the First Gulf War. Millennials were in childhood, trying to understand how the world works. And as they progressed into adolescence and young adulthood, Generation X became parents to Generation Z. Technologically, upon the backbone of the internet were added the innovations of commercially available global positioning, GPS, and the popularity of mobile devices like the iPhone. In world events, America was attacked by Al-Qaeda on September 11th, setting us on a course to war in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And the East Coast was rocked by a series of record-breaking hurricanes. In pop culture, the most popular television show was American Idol, a reality show about regular people trying to find a path to be famous. The most popular song was Beyoncé's Irreplaceable, a song about how completely unfazed she is as she kicks out one live-in boyfriend and brags that her next live-in boyfriend is already on the way over. The most popular movie was The Dark Knight, an adrenaline-fueled ride through a dystopian hellscape of anarchy, mayhem, and moral subjectivism, in which the villains are celebrated far more than the hero. In marriage and family life, every adverse trend that began in the 1950s continued. The average ages of marriage rose to 28 for men and 26 for women. The average family size continued to fall to 1.8 children, less than half the size of a family in 1950. 71% of all mothers with children under 18 were working. And though the divorce rate ostensibly fell from 20% to 17%, that is more than explained and counterbalanced by the decline in marriage rates. You can't get divorced if you never get married. But cohabitating couples do separate at a higher rate than married couples. In any case, 37% of Generation Z was born to an unwed mother, and 38% of all children under 18 lived in households of a single adult or two cohabitating but unmarried adults, not necessarily their parents. And that brings us to the current period. Beginning in 2014, projected to end around 2034, millennials are parents. Our children are Generation Alpha. And Generation Z is in their adolescence and young adulthood. The challenge we confront as millennials and Generation Z is to recognize and understand the problems that our marriages and families face, to diagnose the causes, and develop mindsets and strategies that will enable us to have successful marriages and families. We need to create a new inflection point that begins to stop and reverse the destructive cycles and trends by which our society has been destroying itself for the past 50 and 70 years. Hopefully, we can provide our children and grandchildren with more favorable conditions to achieve healthy, fulfilling lives in accordance with what we know about human flourishing. Ultimately, developing those mindsets and strategies, setting those conditions, understanding these problems, their causes, and their solutions is the goal of Season 2 of the Mr. Homemaker podcast. I do not yet know what the right mindsets and strategies are. This podcast and YouTube channel is my best effort to share my journey as I travel it. I do not know where it will lead, but I do have a strong intuition, a working hypothesis, that many answers lie in understanding the period from 1950 to 1970, as the greatest generation passed the baton to the baby boomers. I also have a strong suspicion that fully understanding that period will require a survey of an even broader conceptual and chronological landscape, specifically examining how individualism, moral subjectivism, and nihilism, which are in full bloom today, began to bud during the Enlightenment period, beginning nearly 400 years ago. But exploring that landscape will have to wait for another bonus episode, hopefully one with the help of a special guest who can offer a distinct paradigm and perspective. And so I invite you to join me again as I welcome one or more guests on the show for future bonus episodes to retrace modern history and its unforeseen impacts on marriage, family, and society. In the meantime, please share your thoughts on YouTube, social media, or by contacting me directly at mr-homemaker.com. Until next time, happy homemaking.
Thank you so much for attending today's discussion with Mr. Homemaker. Please take this opportunity to subscribe, like, and share this episode with your spouse, relatives, and friends. We further invite you to access complimentary information and resources at our website, mr-homemaker.com. There you will also find links to join the discussion via email or social media. And please, support the Mr. Homemaker podcast and receive merchandise and membership benefits on patreon.com. Until next time, farewell.